Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. We're back with the window watchers for the summer. Plenty of transfers to unpack over sort of the next 45 minutes to an hour. Adam Harvey joined by Southwell and Samuel Seaman. Of course, we want your comments, your questions, anything transfer related, anything Norwich City related, and we'll work our way through those in a short while. Connor, let's start with incomings and maybe the goalkeeper department, because there's been quite a bit of movement maybe on that over the past week in terms of rumours and various other parts. Just give us the latest, I suppose, and the lay of the land on the goalkeeping department.
I was hoping you were going to say his name so I could just copy the pronunciation of what you were going for. Yeah, it's as you were, really. I think as we reported in the week, still assessing goalkeeping options, still looking at goalkeepers. Feels like we're probably at a stage now where they're focusing primarily on three options. Obviously, two of those are public. I'm sure there's other targets in the background being weighed up as well. But clearly Vladan Kovacevic, Jakub Stolarczyk. Yeah, butchered that. Someone give us a phonetic spelling of or how you say that. Would be useful. So he's clearly one they like, and I think someone and there'll be others on that list as well. And yeah, that's kind of where we're at with it. Clearly, obviously, there were some reports in the week that on the Leicester keeper there was a bid that was submitted for him. And you know, I would suggest that's probably. That is where we find ourselves on him, which is an interesting one. I know a lot has been maybe made of that at the Leicester ends. You know, why do you bid for someone who's just signed an extension? But that was the same as, let's say, the extension that was in Jakob Sorensen's contract or others. That was sort of club activated. There wasn't anything that he had to do on that, and it's clearly a very interesting dynamic with him because he played 10 Premier League games for Leicester, and they're in a very interesting situation. I think there was a lot of noise around Ruud van Nistelrooy and his position, and just generally feels quite a bit of uncertainty around there. And clearly they need to they because of the financial stuff, which again is well documented, they could probably do a few sales this year. Obviously there's a situation with Hermansen if he doesn't go, and you know this lad is staying there to be a number two. Does he want to be a number two? If he came to Norwich, he knew he would be first choice. I would suggest in this game, thank you very much, Ronsky, Stolarczyk. Yes, that is right. I think that is the pronunciation that someone said to me, actually. That does sound right. So if we could just, I'll write that down somewhere when I stop talking. But yeah, look, when you're in and around this game for a long time, you know, and you gents will know, and people watching will know, bids don't go in without some sort of communication. Generally, that whoever they're bidding for, be it coaches, is something we've had very recently, that there would be some sort of degree of receptiveness to that bid. Clearly, what makes this a challenging aspect is the Leicester dimension and where he fits in with all of that. Clearly not a player. You can see that from the reports that have come out subsequently that they want to lose, and one that they rate very highly. But yeah, at this stage, I think he's one of a few that are still being assessed. I don't think he's the one that Norwich City are hell-bent on trying to get at this stage, and clearly there's a lot that would have to happen for him to become a Norwich City player. So yeah, that's where we are on it, really, and that's probably where we are across the board in terms of positions. We're still, I know it doesn't feel like it because Norwich's season was over by about March, wasn't it? But we're still early in the summer. The players aren't back for pre-season training yet. There are so many elements that still need to turn and move, and players coming back from holiday and various different aspects, and clubs kind of knowing where they are and what situations they're in that will move that. And yeah, again, I think that's probably where we are on the goalkeepers, really. Clearly one that Norwich are very keen to do, I think, as we've reported for a long time, and it's pretty obvious, really, because of the Angus Gunn stuff. So yeah, still kind of weighing different options up, and you know, I think there's probably an element as well that marries into the centre back change. And Sam wrote a very good piece. I recommend anyone to go and read it on kind of the homegrown slots that Norwich have available, and you've got to juggle that. You've got to juggle ESE slots, and really you look at two really good ones in terms of being able to get those minutes up. You'd look at centre back in terms of homegrown slots, and goalkeeper in terms of players that amass a lot of minutes and give you kind of a guarantee of some homegrown slots. I could see a world where Norwich try and map it up. So I know we're going to talk about Harry Darling, but let's say they brought him in. That would then probably allow them to do a foreign goalkeeper. If they didn't get Harry Darling and they had to go down a foreign route for centre-back, it would probably push them into a domestic market for a goalkeeper. So these are all the elements that are still up in the air and are being spun. And yeah, that's kind of where we are at the moment. Lots of options being explored, lots of inquiries and elements being done to try and get deals further down the line before you then decide which one to advance with. So yeah, that's where we are on that front at the moment.
Yes, just one other goalkeeper that Finley's asking about that came out last night, Sam. Just want to clear up Philip Marshall, the Aston Villa goalkeeper.
Yeah, not one Norwich are looking at the moment as far as whether it was sort of agent-led. Obviously, you don't want to speculate too much, but when there are several teams involved, it does usually feel a bit like that. But I think the report in question actually mentioned that he would be coming in as a sort of second choice to a more experienced goalkeeper. And obviously that's the plan for Dan Grimshaw. So I don't know if he was somebody who they looked at a long while ago. Obviously they have plenty of names on their radar, but right now when a number one is their priority, they feel they've got their, at least initially, a second choice in the building in Grimshaw. It definitely won't be Marshall who comes in, and I think that'll be a different club for him. So yeah, we saw those last night, checked them out, and yeah, I don't think he's one of the options, but you can see why when Norwich are so clearly and so publicly looking for a new goalkeeper, why maybe certain people would be interested in linking certain players with covering that position. But I think you look at sort of his career so far, his age, his profile. I think he was on loan in League Two last. So for him to have jumped up and replaced Angus Gunn, an experienced Championship goalkeeper, and when you consider some of the other names who have been linked with Norwich and who they're looking at, Stolarczyk played in the Premier League last season. Kovacevic obviously played for Legia in the Polish top flight, and he's currently a Sporting Lisbon player. So somebody who played last season in League Two, definitely doesn't look like the sort of profile they're looking for as a new number one. And yeah, as far as we understand it, not one they're considering at the moment.
Yes, we spoke around him a little bit the other day, and you mentioned him already, Connor. Obviously, Harry Darling at Swansea, homegrown defender, 25, I think he is off the top of my head. So still got a lot of growth in him. Worked with Liam Manning previously at MK Dons, very highly regarded. Where are we at maybe in terms of him and his move to Norwich potentially?
Yeah, again, as you were really clearly, because of his situation, he can afford to wait and be patient and let the situation play out. And I'm sure you've got situations there where clubs are maybe being played off against others. Look, from what we gather, and I think this is no different to what Liam Manning and Ben Napper said really on Monday. He is, because of his age, because of his situation, because of how many games he's played in the Championship, he is somebody that a lot of Championship clubs would like to add, and it's very rare you get kind of a player at this stage who've played at the level that he has for so long and probably excelled at it as well, be available on a free transfer. I guess maybe Tyrese Dolan is probably another you could put in those category. Those feel like the two kind of hottest ones in the Championship, and thus Norwich are going to have to be quite patient on him. I suspect it sounds very much like they're obviously very much in the running, and I think clearly they'll be banking on the Liam Manning factor, won't they, to try and bring him to the football club. But of course, he's got a young family. I'm sure, geographically, Cambridge, much has been made of that. But is he much closer to Norwich than he is Birmingham? Not really. So then it would, of course, come down to a whole host of different elements financially as well. And I think the feeling that there has been throughout really around him is that if he does end up at Norwich City, which is a possibility, they will have done very well ahead of basically all the Championship interest that there is in him. And you just get the sense maybe that there is a hope he can. Certainly I was speaking to someone in the week who seemed to feel that it was between Norwich and Birmingham. You never really know. You never know what clubs are going to come to the table and how much. I know there's been the Rangers element at this stage. It doesn't sound like there's a huge amount in that, but again, you can't discount Russell Martin getting his feet under the table and picking up the phone and that all changing. So yeah, with him, I would expect it probably to go on a little bit longer. Ultimately, he's got free reign. The pre-season's not for a couple of weeks to basically play the field and see what options come in and then to make obviously his decision and to try and speak to and sound out and get sales pitches from all of these clubs. Seen Sheffield United mentioned for him this morning as well, although obviously clearly huge amounts of uncertainty there as we speak around Chris Wilder. So yeah, I think it's one to watch. Obviously, and we know that from the horse's mouth, one that Liam Manning would like at Norwich City, one that Norwich City would like at Norwich City. The question is, does Harry Darling want to be at Norwich City? And that is obviously the key part of this puzzle that probably needs to be solved in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, if they like him and not much has really developed from Monday's press conference, to be honest. I think it'll be waiting now for Harry Darling to make his decision on where he wants to go next. And he's got a few options. And of course, it's worth noting as well, he's got an offer on the table from Swansea. So it's not beyond the realms that he remains at that football club, although it feels at this stage pretty unlikely.
Yeah, while we wait for a conclusion on that, Sam, one player that won't be coming to Norwich in terms of the centre-back department is Nat Phillips, who I think there was a few sort of tentative links yesterday regarding him maybe being a link to a move to Carrow Road. We can clear that one up and put a line through that.
Yeah, again, Nat Phillips, not one they're looking at. I'm a bit of a sort of bringer of doom at the moment. I've now already swiped away 2 transfer rumours, but yeah, Phillips is in the same category as Marshall. Really, not one that that they're looking at. I think you could understand the links, and to be honest, the calibre isn't too bad. He's obviously played a lot of games for Liverpool. Had, I think, by all accounts, a pretty good season on loan at Derby last season as well. It looks like, having stayed up, that they're quite keen to keep him at the club, but you have to probably consider the age profile. He's 28 now, I think, and in terms of his style of football as well, although we know that Manning is likely to be a little bit more pragmatic maybe than Johannes Torp was, it is still important to him, if he possibly can, to try to dominate the ball, to try and be quite attacking. And I think Phillips' style of play is maybe slightly more rudimentary. You have to remember how defensive Derby went at times last season, and a lot of the way that they set up, although they did it effectively on a number of occasions, was about sitting behind the ball, not so much about pressing high or covering a lot of space in behind. And those are all things that I think Phillips would be required to do quite a lot more of in a Norwich shirt, even under Manning. So yeah, I could see the links, and I think if Norwich had signed him, you would have said, okay, he's not a terrible squad option. They do need some centre-backs, and they are sort of lacking experience in that area, apart from Shane Duffy, who I think we've already had questions about, and who everyone knows there's sort of an uncertainty about his future. So I think for a few reasons, if they had brought him in, you wouldn't have said it was the end of the world. But in a market where they maybe do have, to be honest, a little bit more cash to spend, and they can look at some of the slightly more expensive options, I think they can afford to be a little bit more selective and a little bit more optimistic about maybe how many of the characteristics they want from a player, how many characteristics the players that they're looking at have that they want. So yeah, I think Phillips would have been okay, but ultimately not a player they're looking at the moment. Doesn't quite fit exactly what they're trying to do under Liam Manning, and particularly when you look at the age profile, what they want to do and what Ben Napper wants to do with the age profile and the way that squad is going to go. I think they will definitely look, as we've seen from Darling and Kovacevic and a few of the other options already discussed, that they are willing to look at sort of prime players, but I don't see them going for sort of 28, 29-year-olds or loads of those, particularly not the sort of profile that maybe Phillips is. So, yeah, another one, unfortunately, to put a line through. Yeah, he was sort of in a similar bracket to Marshall, and yeah, we sort of checked that one out when it came out, and yeah, as I think Connor confirmed on X yesterday, not one that Norwich are believed to be looking at.
Yeah, just staying on the theme of defence, but maybe moving away from peak players to younger players. There was a link, I think it was last night or night before now, surfaced around Kamani Miller at Wigan, a young fullback who's made a handful of appearances in League One. What's kind of the latest on him, Connor?
Yeah, not one at this stage that is obviously being considered first team wise. Look, you never know. I think it can be quite tough with development players to keep a constant track on who is and who isn't and who has watched. And again, I would maybe put him in the same category as what Sam was saying earlier with Marshall. I think when there's a few clubs mentioned, you're always initially a little bit skeptical about why it's been put out there, who it's been put out there for, who it benefits. So yeah, look, potentially one that Norwich have watched at this stage, but yeah, as we understand it, not one that is active at this point. That doesn't mean that he won't be at any stage during the summer, and if he was, certainly wouldn't anticipate that being a first team addition. So yeah, not one at this stage that I think is probably across where Ben Napper's head is at the moment. And let's be honest, right back, why he is right back, isn't he? Left back. But I think both fullback positions, really, they're pretty well stocked. Obviously, we had the Toffolo stuff earlier in the summer, which, again, I know Sam was across. And again, in a similar world, that feels at the moment, obviously, we could probably maybe throw a little bit of doubt on Jack Stacey. That maybe feels like the one who potentially could. There could be some movement around if he decided that he wanted to go and try and get some more first team football, obviously with Callum Fisher coming in. But again, you never know what Liam Manning's view on these players are. But certainly fullback wise, it feels like they're pretty well stocked at the moment. I'd probably suggest it's more central defenders at this moment in time, which is where the priority is. And you can kind of see why they've lost Callum Doyle. We've already spoken about the Shane Duffy element. You've got a couple of young guys maybe who need to go out on loan and get some more minutes under their belt. It does feel like they could be a little bit short in those positions. So yeah, I think it's probably more central defence where the focus is on at the moment. That being said, and this probably underscores all of it, there is quite a big bit of churn kind of under 21s development wise that needs to happen this summer because they're quite thin on the ground. So yeah, I would probably, as the summer progresses, expect a lot more of those kind of development links. I know that we've had a couple, haven't we, the Fleetwood lad, and there was the Swindon one, which both of those I think we said were kind of genuine links at that stage. So yeah, there'll be business at that level, but I don't think at this stage that Mellor is one that is being looked at with a first team focus.
Working our way down the pitch, can see a few people maybe mentioning midfielders as well in the comment section. Dylan saying anything on midfielders talked about. Let's start with Maxi Oyedele, Sam, midfielder who I think was more linked to the Championship clubs as a wider bracket. A few people maybe thinking, given Norwich are in the market for one, that he might be a potential one to arrive at Carrow Road. I don't want to bring you more doom and gloom, but can you just give people the latest on him?
Yeah, cheers for that, Adam. It's again, he's not one that they're currently looking at, but I could absolutely see everything that people were talking about when that link came about. Somebody sent me I think it was Fabrizio Romano, wasn't it, originally, who said there were Championship clubs interested in him, and he's 20. He's homegrown. He plays in an area that we know Norwich are looking at as quite an urgent priority for their transfer window. He played with Kovacevic last season, so clearly, even if they weren't watching specifically for him, Norwich scouts will have seen him play last season as well. So it did feel when that link came out, although there weren't any specific clubs linked, like it would almost be the perfect fit for Norwich. And it is an interesting one. I think the profile was interesting as well. Obviously, they are looking for that central midfielder, despite the number of players they've got in that area. Clearly, they feel they need to add a little bit of quality. I don't think they're struggling for quantity whatsoever. I wrote a piece yesterday about some of the options they had there, and I think they've got 9 first-team central midfielders currently to choose from. So if Liam Manning does go for a 3-4-3, as he often did at Bristol City, then he's got to choose 2 from 9. Even with a 4-3-3, he's got to choose only a third of his midfielders. But clearly something where they want to add, in terms of the quality, they don't feel they've got quite enough to be challenging for the playoffs next season as they wish to do. And it looked like maybe he was somebody who could offer a little bit of that. Obviously, there would have been a decent amount of development, and I wonder if that comes into it a little bit. I think we saw with Ante Sienats, and although he did look very strong towards the end of the season, maybe the fact that it took a little bit of time, that the Polish league is quite different to English football. So I don't know if that would have come into their thinking if they did consider him. But again, I think Romano said 2 Championship clubs. One of them is not Norwich City. So yeah, although I could completely understand those links, and when I first heard about it, I actually thought, yeah, that seems pretty probable that it is Norwich. Yeah, again, continuing the theme from today's video, yeah, not one that Norwich are looking for.
Yes, Finley asking any update on those 2 midfielders who were mentioned. One they like, but unlikely. I think he's referring to Tuki Chukwuemani and Pelle Madsen over there in Denmark. What's the lay of the land with those 2, Connor?
Yeah, I think with those guys, you can basically file them under ones that Johannes and Glenn liked a lot. Particularly, obviously, the lad in Denmark. There's obvious connections there. Not ones that at this stage I think are live or active. Doesn't mean again they haven't been watched and they haven't been liked at various stages. But I think it was probably more too that those guys were going to try and push forward rather than ones that are active. I recognise basically all we've done in the opening 90 minutes is quash stuff, but it's sometimes as important as confirming stuff, and we try and sort the fact from fiction, so to speak. So yeah, those 2 were ones that were liked, and yeah, those ones not being pursued any further. But as Sam rightly says, definitely think that the central midfield is an area they're looking alongside, obviously the positions that we spoke about in terms of goalkeeper and centre back, which is interesting because it feels like, as Sam said, they've got 9 of them. They're pretty well stocked. For me, I still think they're lacking a really kind of different number 6 option. They've got a lot of technical players. It would be good to have someone quite quite physical, quite athletic, quite maybe more defensively minded, particularly maybe alongside a Jacob Wright to really build a solid base there. Obviously, I wrote a piece about Liam Gibbs in the week. That's really interesting. Can he come in and force his way in? He kind of did last summer and then got injured, and it actually completely passed me by that he started on the opening day at Oxford, Liam Gibbs, and that is obviously the type of challenge that he's got. If not, then I think we're probably all of the view that he needs to get out and play some games. There's obviously big summers in there for the likes of Anis Ben Slimani. I put Emi Marcondes in there, Oscar Schwartau, Mankel Forsen, lots of players who maybe showed in flashes what they were capable of, but not consistently. And again, as Sam said, it will all come down to maybe what the formation is that Liam Manning chooses. But it feels like they're going for quality rather than quantity. And I guess we could probably file that alongside centre backs because they're not exactly short of those either. Maybe on the left side they are, but certainly not on the right side. So lots of interesting stuff going on at the moment and being pushed forward and lots of things happening in the background. And as I said, it's still 13th of June. We're still in the first half of June. So sometimes things don't get moving till July, which tends to be, I think, from memory, certainly the busiest month, particularly in a non-tournament year. It can be a bit later, but I would expect probably quite a lot of this, to be honest, until July, maybe with the odd one here and there getting completed. And obviously that applies to outgoings as well. So I think you can at this moment maybe keep those names if we're going with lines and whatnot. Maybe just begin to put a line in pencil, but I wouldn't completely rub them out at this stage. But it feels unlikely with those two.
Yeah, probably not going to help you with this perception, Sam, because I'm going to ask you about a Brazilian winger, Gustavo Prado, who was linked earlier in the week. I think he's 20 years of age. Evidently Norwich are scouting in South America. They've done work there previously, still have a couple of ground scouts there. So one you'd imagine they've come across. What's kind of the latest with him?
Yeah, I think you've teased it a little bit there, Adam. And again, as you said, probably one who they have seen a lot of. I mean, it does feel like a situation where you could almost link anyone. And to be honest, Ben Napper and his recruitment team have probably heard of them. I think I've had those conversations with him before where you can almost reference any footballer and he'll go, oh, yeah. Because you have to bear in mind, these recruitment teams are looking at these databases all the time. It's their whole job, and they've got thousands of names that they've probably processed at Colney. But he's not currently one again who they're likely to sign in the here and now. Not one they're looking at. I think it's a link that's probably decreased a little bit in the last couple of years. There was one point, I think, when Norwich's Brazilian link and South American link was quite public and quite clear and talked about even more often than it is now, where it felt like every week there was a Brazilian left back coming up who we had to sort of dig into and find out if there was any truth in that. So it does feel at least like the volume of those names has decreased a little bit. But again, not one that they're currently looking at or one that they're currently keen to do a deal for. It is interesting, the sort of wide area. I think although that's not one they're considering, I think has a priority right now. I think we've said this and written about this in various places, but right now it seems that the focus is on a first choice goalkeeper, a quality centre back, and a central midfielder as well. I think if you asked Ben Napper, then it would be hard for him to deny that they do need wingers this summer. Obviously, Borja Sainz looking pretty likely to depart, as we'll come on to. Ono Hernandez left the club on a free. Mate Jurasek, although I think there was talk from Napper when we last spoke to him about him, or not when we last spoke to him, the time before that, about him maybe even feeling like a new signing this summer, and that's definitely valid. But right now, without any proof really that that's going to be the case, do you go into it assuming that he's going to be one of your frontline wingers, especially with some of the fitness considerations? I don't know about that. We know that Lewis Dobbin is somebody who they like very much from his spell at the club, but maybe things have gone quiet there for now, and it's one that they might revisit in a little bit, and he's one of a number of options they're considering. So I think it's fair to say that they probably will be active in the wide areas. But again, sorry to just bring all this doom and gloom, and I'm sure we will come on to some positives at least at some point in the show. So keep tuned in. That's probably what we're doing, saving the best till last. But he's another one who I don't think they'll be moving for, even if, as you said, they probably are aware of him from their work in South America.
Yes, let's talk a little bit about potential outgoings that are on the move. One of those is Sainz, who there's been a lot of interest in over the course of the summer. We've spoken about him pretty much on every one of these shows we've done so far. There's been a couple of bids on the table. One of those is from Napoli, we believe. One of those is from Porto. There was the sort of report, I think, from Sky Sports that Norwich had turned down an offer around £12.7 million for him. Obviously, only got a year left on his contract. Connor, what do you kind of expect, I suppose, to happen over the moving weeks with him?
Leave, I think, is probably what I'm expecting to happen with him. Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I must admit, when sort of the names of the clubs came out, I was a bit taken aback by it, really, because I sort of hadn't told myself that it would be that level of club that would come in for him, which is, and maybe that's a wake up call to maybe the perception sometimes that you can have on players who are at Norwich. And we spoke about this last week. Maybe you can kind of downplay what they did, or you've got a different view because you've seen them over the course of the season. But it was still an incredibly impressive campaign, whether you want to look at it as just the first half and the second half. Actually, if you look at it as a collective, it was still very good in terms of output, the best of his career, the best of his goal scoring output of his career as well. Still think there's so much for him to develop and improve on. And then probably if you'd have asked me at the start of the summer around fee, I'd have said, wow, well, if they could get anywhere near what they got for Jonathan Rowe, bearing in mind in the Rowe case, they had a year option to kind of fall back on. They had that as a little bit of security from a negotiation perspective. They don't have that with Sainz. So I'd have said if they get anything in and around that, they will have done very, very well. To be in a position where clearly the interest is at a level where you can reject bids of that number for a player who's got 1 year left on his deal, I think is incredibly positive. That speaks volumes to the level of interest there is, and clearly where they feel that number can get to in the coming weeks. And it's worth saying that they have remained and do remain in talks with both of those clubs around Sainz. It's not a simple open and shut case where bid comes in, it's rejected, then there's nothing. I think it's been quite a fluid conversation on those parts. And I have to say, I could see it not being worlds away from that figure. Whether they could get it slightly closer to 15 or not, I'm sure will be their aim. But of course, you have to juggle it, because clearly there is a player there who is depreciating kind of every month that he's at Norwich City, whereby every month you get closer to January and clubs will begin to think, if we were sat here in August, if you're a club, do you sit there and go, well, you just hold tight then in January? And if you're from overseas, you can obviously speak to him then about a pre-contractual agreement. So it does feel like one that probably would be better for everyone if it was done sooner rather than later. And yeah, it's just now getting to the figure that Norwich City want, and that clearly is helped and aided by the fact that if you have multiple clubs coming in with interest as well, from what we gather, there's Premier League interest, there's interest in Greece, interest in Spain, interest in Turkey, and there's been kind of no bids from any of those areas as of yet. So it could be that one club hits that number and then 4 or 5 try and match it and do the same. So certainly my feeling is his preference is Athletic Bilbao. Clearly a lot of ties to that region. His uncle played for the club. They only sign players from the Basque region. Interestingly, today there's been reports in Germany about Nico Williams and Bayern Munich meeting the release clause that he has in his deal, which is mandatory. Every player who plays in Spain and Portugal, I think, have those release clauses as part of their contract, which is why you see Kovacic and a 60 million release fee being mentioned. That's just standard. And whether my expectation would be if Nico Williams does get moving and that Bayern deal does begin to pick up pace, you could see a world where Sainz and Bilbao probably more pertinently pick up the phone to Norwich and try and thrash out a deal. And certainly I think if that option was on the table, that feels like the one that he would go for, and very attractive, obviously, for personal reasons as well. So yeah, it's still moving, still fluid, and obviously as it stands here today, I know there's some people on various platforms that are trying to claim otherwise, but absolutely not the case that number has been met or is close to being met at this stage. The conversations are ongoing, but as of certainly about 40 minutes ago, that situation is as it was. So I think it's still watch this space. I'd still expect that to move pretty quickly over the next 2 weeks or so. I think it's probably, I wrote about this earlier in the week, but I think it probably is time for everybody actually to accept that now feels like the best time for Norwich to get maximum value for Sainz to probably get maximum opportunity as well. And it feels like one of those weird cases that you don't get very often around the player that's done what he did, where everyone's probably willing to shake hands and go in a different direction. There's something quite nice about that. So yeah, we'll see. But yeah, lots of interest and enough interest at the level where bids are coming in at that level that makes you think that it will move and be done pretty quickly.
Yes, Luke asking on YouTube, were you surprised by the calibre of clubs linked to sign? Seems like he's going to be another great success story like Sarah to show players that Norwich is a great gateway into European clubs. What's sort of your response to that, Sam? I mean, Napoli, Porto, Atletico Bilbao, Villarreal have also been linked. Some pretty big names there.
Yeah, I mean, yes is the simple answer. I think Connor said just then that he was a little bit surprised when he heard of the caliber of club, and personally I was, to be honest, even when you sort of looked at the profile of the leagues and you heard a little bit about the clubs before we knew who they were, you thought it's interesting, with Sainz, given some of the limitations we've put on him in terms of what he could do moving on from Norwich. It does feel to me like there isn't loads of progression to come. It does feel like there are quite a lot of weaknesses to his game, but it does sound like there's interest from all over the world. And I suppose, as Connor said, it does kind of highlight that when you see a player in such close proximity, I think it can both skew your perception in terms of how good they are, but also how bad they are. I think there are times when, you look at players and because you watch them every week, you see strengths that maybe other people don't see. You see the consistency rather than the high moments. And that makes you rate players more highly than maybe they would be in the market. And then it's almost the other way around with Sainz, because we've seen in the last couple of months, every one of his weaknesses, every one of his poor performances, it feels like a bit of a surprise. But actually, so much of football, especially when you're not in the bubble of a club, is about those moments that capture the attention, that sort of get the highlights. And you have to remember how many of those there were early on in the season. I think it's been said a number of times now that he could have had a goal of the season competition himself. So when you really think about it, I don't think it's a surprise that he's managed to attract as much attention as he has. As far as these clubs then watching his, obviously they won't have watched every minute he played, but watching the large bulk of his recent work and deciding that he's still a player they feel could come in, and in Napoli's case, for example, could add to a squad that's just won Serie A, I suppose tells you a lot about his talent. But it will be interesting if he steps up. Obviously, we saw a similar situation with Rowe, where I think a few people, almost similarly to how they are with Sainz now, were saying, given he struggled a little bit with injuries in the second half of the season, maybe didn't have those high points that he had almost up to sort of January, February 2024. I think a few people were wondering how he would step up. And as we've seen at Marseille, I'm sure he's confident that he can turn it round, but it wasn't necessarily the dream first season in France for him. So I think Sainz will be out to almost outdo Rowe, not consciously, but in terms of, you look at what Rowe's delivered, I think Sainz would hope for a better season than that. But it does feel like those comparisons maybe are legitimate. I'm interested to see how he gets on, certainly. And in a way, you almost look at those weaknesses, some of the defensive problems, the fact that he's not particularly in games and that he can sort of drift in and out. And maybe you say, actually, if he can do all that and still score 18 goals in a championship season, still make the team of the season and be talked about as much as he is, then if he fulfills his potential, he could certainly go on and play at that high level. So I suppose you can look at it either way. Financially, you also have to consider, I think 12.7 million for me, as Connor said, was, I'm surprised to see them rejecting bids of that size this early on in the summer. And I think they've done well with the fee almost already, although we haven't obviously seen what it'll ultimately end up being. But for those clubs, I think you have to consider that, the sort of money that they'll be working with, the sorts of players they've already got on their wage bill and things like that. This isn't a particularly expensive transfer for them. They've got a good opportunity with him 12 months out from the end of his deal. And yeah, you look at his season, I suppose when you break it down, I'm not overly surprised, but having been in that Norwich City bubble for so long and seeing all of those struggles that he's had in the last few months, I was a little bit surprised when we initially got the news, but I think it makes more sense as you sort of think about it, really.
Yes, a lot of people asking questions around the US striker as well. Beck saying need to offer Darwin anything he wants Sargent to lead. I've seen City chat on YouTube saying what are the chances Josh Sargent stays. Captain Cruel saying Connor, your starting 11 for the opening day had Sarge in it. Surely he'll be gone too. So a lot of people asking around Josh Sargent. I also saw Andy as well saying with Mbeumo on the way out of Brentford, Sarge would seem like an obvious replacement. Do we know any clubs that are interested? So what's kind of the latest with Josh Sargent? I suppose given the US element and their struggles at the moment as well, he's going to want to try and push his way back into that squad. It feels like he's probably going to have to move this summer for that to happen.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, just to go back to the comment, he said I had him in a starting line. That was on a Q&A earlier in the week, and I did. And that's basically sums up the situation for me. I mean, when's the first game of the Championship season? August the 9th, is it? So there'd still be just under a month of a transfer window to run alongside that. So I think both things could be true, that could happen and that Josh Sargent could not be a Norwich City player come the end of it. Yeah, I think with that one, we've just spoken about Borja Sainz and why that probably makes sense for Norwich to do try it quite quickly. With Josh Sargent, very different situation. They've got a lot more cards in their possession. Clearly the 3-year contract helps that. That gives them more security. Will mean ultimately if Josh Sargent does leave, it will be for a bigger fee. And yeah, obviously an interesting one. No official bids as of yet, but Norwich aware of lots of interest, and clearly Roma is one that's come out. I know there's been, I think, Lee's chatter basically for the last 2 years. It was kind of said to me a little while ago that maybe they were aiming their sights a little bit higher in terms of strikers, but we'll see. That doesn't mean they wouldn't or don't eventually come back to Josh Sargent. And I'm sure clearly in Daniel Farker, somebody who worked with him at Norwich, knows him very, very well. There's other Premier League interest as well. I know Bournemouth were big admirers of him last summer, but obviously they went on to sign a striker. I've seen someone mention about Mbeumo and clearly the Brentford element. I think that's very difficult to pinpoint at the moment, given all of the uncertainty there now after Thomas Frank has left. And obviously clearly there was big MLS interest last summer as well. And given he's just sat outside a squad where lots of MLS players have been included, I know it's a Gold Cup and that kind of is how it works for that cycle. But generally, even the one before that, he was left out for a couple of strikers at MLS level. That doesn't mean that his hopes of going to a home World Cup are going to be dashed by playing at that level. So I wouldn't totally rule that out either. And I think there's some German interest as well. So yeah, plenty of interest in him. So again, much like Sainz, it's just kind of a waiting game to try and see and wait where where the numbers get to and whether they get to anywhere near where Norwich want them to. I think it was 20 million euros they turned down last summer for Sargent from Cincinnati. If they'd have met the figure, he would have been gone. So yeah, it's not beyond the realms. What I would say about Sargent, look, maybe this is famous last words given what we encountered last summer, but you don't get the sense that he is the type of person, having had a really good career with Norwich. You saw how quickly he sought to clarify those comments that came out in the most recent international break before the end of the season about his future, because he was kind of, I think, a little bit worried about how fans would take to him after that. So I don't get the sense that he's one that would really kick off if he was here beyond the summer. And I don't think it's as certain as maybe Borja Sainz is to depart at this stage. I think that's still probably probable. But again, there's lots more that probably needs to happen. I think it's a tougher deal to do for clubs than Sainz at this stage, if I'm honest. And that probably works in Norwich's favour. But again, what I would say is that, and this is the case probably for all positions all of the time, Norwich are constantly running processes where they have players and they have shortlists and they have options ready to go. So look, Ben Napper said this, I think, in a Radio Norfolk interview, if Josh Sargent left, they would be willing to commit a very decent transfer fee to a striker. So we'll obviously can hold him account to that if it happens, and they will have various options. I think it's difficult, doesn't it? Because we saw under Stuart Webber often when we were speaking around kind of major sales that Norwich would go and maybe sign a player before selling one. Clearly, there's an element of risk with that because you can end up with two. That doesn't sound like that's going to be the way they work this summer. I think it would have to be Josh Sargent going, and then they'd have to target a striker. They've obviously got Antti Sienats in the building as well. So yeah, at this stage, obviously, sort of in a bit of a holding pattern as with a lot of the players, but there's interest. I suspect at some stage interest will turn into bids, and then it's about, can a club get to where Norwich City have their valuation of Josh Sargent at? And when you consider all of those factors, it feels to me like it could probably go quite late into the summer compared to maybe the Sainz one with where we are with that. Yes,
hopefully that's answered your question there, Ali, in regards to maybe whether Norwich need to sell Sargent before they bring somebody else in. I've seen a few people mentioning the backroom staff in the comment section, Sam. Obviously, that's Kraus and Hogg at Bristol City, Paulie Walnuts and Lorne Small, but on YouTube saying, what about the backroom staff? Can you sort of give the fans any sort of update on where we are with that?
I think it's mostly as you were, but one thing I would have an eye on is the Bristol City managerial appointment timeline. It looks like that's sort of coming to a close now. I think there was confidence earlier on in the week that it would come towards the end of the week. And I think although his name escapes me, they have got a potential replacement for Liam Manning seemingly lined up. And then, you look at the fact that they'll presumably want to bring in their own coaching staff, that probably there is going to be a little bit of churn and a little bit of change there. And maybe then will be the perfect time for Norwich to eventually get their men. As you mentioned, Kraus and Hogg, both sort of long-term associates of Liam Manning, two people who they trust, or who he trusts a lot. I think Kraus actually would have worked with, as Connor pointed out after the unveiling, so I have to give him credit for this one. But I think Kraus would have worked with Napper in the analyst department at Arsenal as well. So there's that link there. And I think the intention very much for Norwich is to get those two in before the start of pre-season and as quickly as possible. It does feel like with sort of Bristol City moving towards a new head coach, like that is more likely. But I suppose what will be particularly telling is when that announcement actually comes and when the detail around that comes. Because if it's a case of the new head coach bringing people in with them and there's still no clarity on Hogg and Kraus, then you probably get the sense that they are digging their heels in a little bit and that they do want that compensation that they would be guaranteed if they don't want to let them go. You do get the sense that that's what they would want if there's no clarity given on that. So I would say that when Bristol City confirm their new head coach and whatever clarity comes with that around the potential futures of Hogg and Kraus, maybe keep an eye out for that, because that will probably impact things quite significantly as it relates to Norwich and their pursuit of getting those two in to help Manning out.
All I would add to that, sorry, Adam, to jump in, is and Sam, articulated it there, is that there's still confidence that two things really, that those two will join and that they will be in situ by the start of pre-season. So I don't get the sense there's any panic on any side at the moment in regards to those two.
Yes, I think it's got to the time of the show. We'll dip into a few of these comments for the last sort of 20 minutes or so. Rude Boy saying, should we aim for an upcoming goalkeeper or keep it safe? Getting a proven, more aging goalkeeper. I suppose that sort of links a little bit with Jedi's question of all the keepers who have been linked. Who do you think we are most likely to sign as our number one keeper and why? So I'll come to you, Connor, first on that.
Yeah, I think the second one, that question from Jedi is difficult, because I'm not sure we're there yet, and obviously it's difficult at this stage to definitively say which goalkeepers they are feeling most keen towards. There's so many factors that go into that decision. There's got to be clearly a willingness on the player side to come. It's financially got to be a deal that could work, and that's why you look at multiple options, because you try and get deals into certain stages, and then maybe you decide which one you want to act on based on that. So yeah, it's a host of things, and that will be age, that will be homegrown. Like I said, I think there's probably an element that maybe is slightly dependent on the Harry Darling situation, and there are other goalkeeping names they're looking at that aren't in the public domain yet as well. So I don't think it's just those two. I know there's been kind of lots of stuff on Sam Tickle, who's one they have watched and liked and asked about, but that's not gone any further. Same with Daniel Batman as well. So there's lots of kind of names still in the frame. It's not a case of they've got one that they are moving on, or they are pushing, or that they are favouring at this stage. You get lots of options that you like. You speak to lots of people, you speak to the clubs, you speak to the agents, you try and get yourself to see which deal perhaps is the most doable. And then obviously within that, you will automatically have a preference. So yeah, I think we can we'll keep an eye on that one and see how it develops. But I'm not sure we're at a stage where there is a definitive, yep, this is number one, and that's who we're pursuing in terms of the goalkeeper from.
Yes, and a few people maybe mentioned Bristol City and whether Norwich could go in there and try and raid them a little bit. I think Jeffman had a question on that. Hi lads, late to the party, but important. Would you view Manning bringing in a player of his own from Bristol City? Feel like Johannes Torp not bringing anyone from FC Nordsjælland hurt him slightly. I also saw somebody else ask a sort of similar question, Rude Boy as well, actually. There we go. Any Bristol City players coming in like Knight, O'Leary or Twine? So what's kind of your feelings, I suppose, on that, Sam?
One to keep an eye on, probably. I think right now it doesn't sound like there's anyone they're aggressively pursuing from Bristol City, but of course, there are players who Manning would have worked with last season. Ultimately, they played in the same division as Norwich and finished 7 places higher. So, yeah, I think it's one to keep an eye on. But right now, it doesn't sound like there's anyone they're pushing particularly hard to sign. I think, Knight would be an interesting one, especially given that search for a central midfielder, but probably a little bit too expensive and, to be honest, a little bit too good for Norwich at this stage. You'd expect that if he does leave Ashton Gate, then maybe it would be towards the top end of the division or the Premier League. So, I think there are a few players there who you could look at who could maybe, certainly do a job for Norwich, probably even strengthen that 11 that Manning will have when he comes to make that selection for the opening day of the season. But right now, I don't think they're really aggressively pursuing anyone apart from Hogg and Kraus, really, as far as people currently employed by Bristol City. So, I think that would make sense. I think as far as Jeffman's question, yes, to an extent, but not as much as Torup, because Torup didn't have the backroom staff to sort of support him in that sense. He had one analyst who's still at the club, but he didn't have any coaching staff with him. Obviously, Glenn Riddersholm was a sort of loose link who also came from Denmark, but hadn't actually explicitly worked with Torup before. And I think that was where a lot of it came from. Ultimately, you need leadership both on the pitch, but mainly I'd say from off it. And if you don't have a group of people who know how you work, a sort of a center of power that then everything comes out of, I think it's more difficult and it's a little bit more splintered. So although Manning right now doesn't actually have anyone who's come with him, as we've spoken about with Kraus and Hogg, he's expecting to have people who will do that, who will be able to put the same processes in place. And although you don't get the sense that necessarily Riddersholm was ever, going against Torup's wishes or anything like that, I don't want to, portray that, but they obviously didn't have that familiarity. It was a work in progress. And obviously most managerial appointments are works in progress. I'm sure Manning will improve as the season goes on. The fact that you have to learn each other's styles and improve that relationship while you're in a new league for the first time, you've taken a significant step up in terms of the quality of the football and the attention from Norgeland. I think that was probably an unwelcome distraction for Torup, and it probably didn't help as far as getting that buy-in from players. I think although it would be good, and it's definitely nice to have a representative of yours on the pitch in terms of a former player that you've worked with, I don't see it as being such an essential necessity, maybe as it was, or as it felt like it was for Torup, just because Manning is expected to have that coaching staff alongside him. I mean, ultimately, he had someone who, a couple of months into the season, was brought in Emi Marcondes. I know Oscar Schwartau hadn't actually worked with him before, but he was sort of linked to him in that sense. Anis Ben Silmane, he coached when he was in his teenage years and then had tracked his progress over the years. So it wasn't like Torup had no one on the pitch who he had worked with before. But he didn't have that coaching staff. And for me, when he talked about the fact that he wanted more of his own people, or he should have brought more of his own people, I think that was probably more with reference to the coaching staff. So that's why I'd be less worried if no Bristol City players came in by the end of the window. But with some of the quality in that squad and the fact that obviously Manning knows them well, it's definitely something that I'm sure we'll keep an eye on as the summer unfolds.
Yeah, a few people asking around maybe the Euro Under-21 Championships in the comments. Global Bloodstock saying, any truth that NCFC is sending an observer to the Under-21s Championship in Slovakia? Finley saying, would we have scouts at the Euros? And I also saw a point around, I think it's Patrick Vidra has been linked to a couple of Championship clubs, the Czech midfielder who played pretty well last night against England in a game that, a certain John Rowe, we don't speak around these two much on these channels these days, scored in. So is any sort of comments or thoughts around those, Connor?
They'll definitely have scouts there. They'll scout every single major tournament and youth competition. That's how they found Vicente Reyes, was at a youth tournament like that. So yes, is the short answer. I watched the game last night. Vidra was very impressive, and clearly I can't profess to have watched him at any level. I don't know if Norwich are or aren't in for him, if truth be told. But if that's the level that he plays at for his club, he will be being watched by Premier League teams. I've no doubt about that. But yeah, you never know. I've not heard anything around Norwich with that, so I can't offer any insight into that one, I'm afraid. But yeah, clearly one to watch because he just generally looks a very talented young player, and would certainly fit the bill in terms of midfield if that was the way they wanted to go about it. But I suspect that the queue for him might be quite long, judging on purely last night, which is all I'm going on.
Yes, Andy on YouTube saying, "Hi gents, any news on Duffy to New York? Seemed nail on at one stage, but it's gone very quiet. What do you sort of make of Duffy's future?"
Yeah, I think it was one that in the American press, they maybe tried to quiet a little bit at the time. I think as far as Duffy, he's definitely one who, if an offer came in and somebody wanted to take his contract on, I think that's definitely something that Norwich would be open to. I don't think it would be viewed maybe as the worst thing in the world if he was still here when the window shut. Ultimately, although it felt to me like he did decline a little bit as the season went on, to be honest. He's not necessarily the perfect age for what Ben Napper wants to do. He ultimately does only have a year left on his contract. He wasn't terrible last season. He was still playing week in, week out by the end of the campaign. So I don't think it would be seen as a disaster for Norwich if they end up keeping him by the end of the window. But I think probably for all parties, it would make sense if Duffy could move on this summer. But ultimately, he's somebody who, if we're being honest, is on quite hefty wages, and somebody is going to have to commit to paying those wages. Either that or Norwich would have to agree to paying, still a portion of them while not having him available as an option. So, yeah, I think it's difficult in the sense, to be honest, that you need to attract potential suitors for him. Obviously, New York were linked earlier in the summer, probably in the spring. Actually, it was a few months ago, really. But I think, there was some sort of dampeners on that from the American end. But from what we're told, it sounds very much like Duffy is one that they would be open to moving on. So definitely a sort of watch this space. But right now, it does feel like it's gone pretty quiet. I haven't heard anything to suggest that a move for him is imminent or anything like that. So, that might be one that drags on a little bit. But, it feels pretty likely to me that if a club comes along, says, we'd like to take Shane Duffy, please, and Duffy is on board with the move, then that's one Norwich would probably sanction.
Yes, don't need to worry too much about Cernak. I think that was more one for last season, one that they were looking at as a potential sort of option, and they went with Garassi as well, I think. So that clears that one up. A few other questions here. One around Forsyth, maybe what's kind of his future looking like at Norwich? Would you expect maybe him to be one to potentially Norwich look at to get out on loan next season, Connor?
Yeah, he's an interesting one, isn't he? Because clearly he was pushed forward by Johannes off top. I think he was the first one that got a debut under him, if I'm right. And there was a few. I might have to double check that, but it was in the first home game, wasn't it, against Blackburn? And it was almost a little bit of a surprise that he was given a start. And did very, very well last season and was ultimately kept out by a tackle that was ridiculous and should have been sent off. But we don't need to get into that, but it was absolutely ridiculous. And it's kept him out for a long time, and clearly he's had surgery, so he'll come back into the fold at some stage at preseason. I don't know if that's going to be at the start or not, but he's still very, very young, so you could see a world where maybe they decided to get him out on loan. We've spoken already about the midfield competition, the levels of competition there is, and there's probably uncertainty as well. You don't quite know how he's going to come back from an injury, how quickly he's going to come back, whether he can get himself back up very quickly. Young players are quite durable, so there is a world where he just goes back into training and is absolutely fine and returns to the level he's at. But there is a world where sometimes it's a little bit slower, and if that is the case, and we'll ultimately find out in pre-season, then I could see a world where either he's exposed perhaps a little bit more to under-21s football or sent out on loan. But what you would say with him is twofold, really. The fact he got into the first team in the first place was an incredible achievement. I think is a sign of how highly he was rated, but also the fact that he's got a lot of time on his side. So if it wasn't next season that it happened for him, then that's not to say it wouldn't the year after. So we'll have to see on that one. But I think a lot of it will probably be dependent on his fitness levels and just how he returns from obviously that lengthy injury absence that he had. But clearly a very good young talent.
I think it's worth adding on him that he qualifies as homegrown next summer. So as far as those quotas go, I think he will still be 20 in the summer of 2026. So they won't actually need to register him by then. But if Norwich want more homegrown players in their squad, which is obviously a balance that they've had to address over the last couple of years, then this season would be the best one to send him out, because he would still qualify as a homegrown player if you send him to somewhere in the EFL. He spent 3 years then, registered to an English club, and he would qualify. Whereas this season they would have to make exceptions for him as a non-homegrown player. So in that sense, it would make sense to sort of capitalise now before he then qualifies, and then next season for those matchday squads where you need 7 homegrown players, he would qualify, and that would help Norwich in those stakes. So for that reason, I think that's quite a big plus and a reason why maybe you would want to send him out on loan. But as Connor said, it's quite a developing situation. We saw, the fact that he was actually able to make the Norwich City first team last season. So yeah, when he recovers from that injury, it will definitely be interesting to see what sort of position he's in.
Yeah, one to watch. Finley saying, so the window's shut and Manning now at the club. Would this week be a lot of meetings and discussions regarding recruitment? I'd imagine so.
Yeah, I think Liam's probably gone back on holiday for a few days, which is probably deserved because I think his last one was spent with a lot of time on his phone and phone calls and getting, obviously, the agreement over the line. So I wouldn't surprise me if he's been just given a few days / week to get back out with his family and maybe enjoy a bit more of a settled family holiday where he's not quite being as bombarded with messages. I think Napa said he blew his phone up, didn't he? So his phone maybe needs a little bit of rest as well. But yeah, I'm sure in and amongst that, there'll be recruitment meetings, and he's had recruitment meetings and he's also having input. So yeah, I wouldn't be too worried about that. And I wouldn't, if I'm honest, the shutting of the window is quite procedural, certainly for sort of EFL clubs. It was much more about the Club World Cup, for example. The Sainz stuff with Porto, that was on their side trying to get a deal done in time to take him to the Club World Cup. That hasn't happened, but it doesn't mean that their interest just stops. So those conversations around him have been ongoing ever since then. And obviously it opens 16th, so early next week again officially. So yeah, it doesn't change too much. I don't think. We're still, as I said, it's still such an early point in the summer. So it's not the end of the world that more things haven't moved, and I don't think it's indicative. When I can't remember when they signed Krizene. I mean, we were in Austria at that point, Adam, and it felt like an age since they'd signed anyone, and then it got moving a lot quicker as we got deeper into the window. Albeit there was a Euros obviously last summer that added to that. So I'd probably expect it to go a little bit quicker, but July tends to be the month where there's a lot more movement, I would say, and obviously players return from to preseason testing at the end of this month. So that is the date really where I'd expect a few things to get moving pretty quickly.
Yes, Captain Cruel saying, any reflection at all on the youth players signed over the last 5 years or so who've just ended up being released? I suppose given that Norwich need a big turnover of youth players this summer, Sam, it feels like an area they've really got to try and strengthen given the strategy of the club and, the emphasis on youth players.
Yeah, definitely. As you said, there's going to be quite a significant turnover. I think purely to be able to fill the team to play in Premier League 2 next season, they need a good number of names, given the large numbers who were released this summer. But in terms of the question, I can understand definitely that it's frustrating when there's all this fanfare about players who are brought in and they end up basically amounting to nothing in a yellow and green shirt, but also kind of going for a few different names, seeing what works out, throwing some stuff at the wall. That's sort of the name of the game when it comes to academy recruitment. Ultimately, if every single one of these players was good enough to come and play in a first team, it would be easy. But in terms of the way that those things work out, you sign 5, you probably only expect one of them to go through to the first team. And that's not to say that everyone you sign, you don't believe there's a chance that they could go through. They will only sign players ultimately who they believe can have an impact on the first team, or at least has a chance of making an impact on the first team in the future. But if they, every player they signed for 100k came in with a guarantee that they would go on to be very good in the first team, they would never have to spend 5-10 million on players in the first team. They'd never have to do that diligent work, scouring all the leagues across Europe, trying to find talent and spending a lot of money on that talent. They would just, fill the under 21s every season and then let them progress through to the first team. So although at times I definitely understand the frustration, and sometimes there are names released where you're kind of taken aback and you think, I just watched him play for the under 21s 3 weeks ago and he looked really good. It is a case of almost hedging your bets and trying out a few different options, putting your eggs in a few different baskets, and then ultimately only 1 or 2 of them hatch. But you look at the ratio of players who have come through that Norwich Academy system in recent years compared to other clubs, and compared to themselves, it probably hasn't been that good in the last few years. But ultimately, compared to other clubs and certainly clubs in the Championship, I think they've still got a decent record percentage-wise of, the academy recruitment they do and how many go on to become players for the first team. So I wouldn't say that's a major concern of mine, even if I do understand the frustration when some of those players who you've been keeping an eye on end up getting released, and it feels like a lot of them aren't good enough despite fanfare when they sign.
Yes, let's dip through a few of these and rattle through. He was definitely linked, but one that I think's got a lot of interest and has been released from Arsenal. So I think it's one to maybe watch, but probably a lot of interest. Finley saying thoughts on the Northern Ireland commentator saying McConville's unhappy with his minutes. I suppose you've got Brad Hills, Adeboyega, Duffy, a few options on that right side. What do you make of those comments, Connor?
Yeah, I saw this. I think it's been taken a little bit out of context, if I'm honest. I think he was speaking hypothetically. I think he was talking probably without as much knowledge on the situation, in terms of saying, look, I'm sure going to Norwich he would have wanted to have played more and maybe would have been a bit frustrated he hasn't played more, rather than it maybe being as definitive as he made it. Ultimately, he can comment. That's certainly not what I've heard, and having spoken to Rory at Middlesbrough away, certainly not the reading I got of him at all. And he is quite a level-headed, intelligent person, and I'm sure he will have been aware when he joined Norwich, and in fact he was, because I've interviewed him twice and he's referenced it twice around coming in and the first 6 months being really about his own development. And realistically, is he going to come in and displace Shane Duffy? No. So if that is his view, and I don't think it is by any stretch of the imagination, then I think it's certainly not the one that Norwich City sold him when they signed him in January, if that makes sense. So I think it's been taken a little bit out of context, if I'm honest. I think it was probably a little bit clumsily worded more than anything else. Yes,
two-folder here, Sam. Finley saying, could Kenny leave this summer or January? And Josh saying, what about Nunez? Will he be going? If we want another midfielder, surely some of our midfielders will have to go.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. As I said, 9 options at the moment, 10 when they sign that next one. It does feel like way too many names to have a competitive environment where close to everyone is happy. I suppose what's on their side is that they do have a few younger options. Obviously, Forsyth won't be expecting to start every week next season. Liam Gibbs is one where, although I think he does need minutes, probably after the season he had last season, it's probably unrealistic to expect that he's going to start 40 games this coming season. And Michael Forson is somebody who didn't have loads of game time in his first season at the club. So they've got a few there who, although they're definitely part of that midfield department, I don't think necessarily would expect to start every week, but 10 for me is just too many. So I think some will have to depart. Probably those younger ones are the ones who are more likely to go out, particularly on loan. As far as McLean, it's a really interesting one, because I don't think he's quite in that Duffy bracket where, almost if somebody comes and takes on his wages, then he can go. He is ultimately the club captain. I think although he didn't have his best season last season, there were still plenty of games where you could see his qualities. He doesn't look to me like his age in terms of his footballing ability and how good he's been in the last few years. So I think a lot of that will come down to Manning's judgment. I think when you consider the age profile and things like that, if Manning comes in and says, yeah, I'm not too keen on Kenny McLean, then probably it's a deal that Napa would be willing to do. But I think given the profile of midfielder, particularly that Manning used at Bristol City, I wouldn't rule McLean out of a significant role just yet. So, I think it's probably wait and see a little bit on McLean, but I definitely wouldn't put him in that. If he can go, then he will. Type bracket with Nunez. Pretty much all quiet with him. And it does sort of fit what we were saying going into the summer, given, you can't really see necessarily what the sorts of clubs are that would benefit from signing Marcelino Nunez, and whether the fee that it would cost to buy him would really be worth Norwich losing him for another year. So probably that's one that will drag on a little bit. I think if he stays at the club beyond the end of the window, then maybe Norwich would be in a better position as far as securing him to a new contract. So definitely with both of those sort of ones to keep an eye on. And obviously, time is ticking on both of those deals, but I wouldn't say that they're in the sort of Sainz or Duffy or George Long brackets where probably the club would be happy to move them on. I think that's one where there's a bit of time to wait and see what sort of interest presents itself and how Liam Manning sees things.
All I would add on that, sorry, Adam, and a couple of points really. Firstly, a tongue-in-cheek one. I mean, it's not been summer yet because Kenny McLean's not been linked with Rangers. That's due at some point. We've had that every year for about the last 6, so that will come, I reckon, at some point in the next few weeks. But I think interestingly, we had similar conversations, if you remember, last summer around Grant Hanley, Ashley Barnes, Christian Fashnacht, who were all in a similar kind of cycle and age and status of their Norwich careers. And actually for those guys, it was January where they moved on, when actually it was probably evidence that the football that they were getting given was in a lower supply. But equally, I think if you're a buying club, it's probably a lot easier to do an 18-month contract than it is at this stage to do maybe a 2-year one, matching the money they're on at the moment. Sometimes players at that stage, when there's kind of 6 months left, will favour having that security rather than going into a summer where they have to become a free agent and then, they have to play the field and you don't really know where you stand. So maybe I'd look at January if any market was around, but again, still so much to play. I could see a world where Kenny McLean and Shane Duffy are still quite important players, even if it's maybe not as important as they have been over the course of their time. So that's all I would add on those guys. Really, I think Sam summed it up pretty nicely there, to be honest.
Yeah, a couple of people just asking around maybe academy players that could be in the fold for pre-season. Dylan saying any players from the academy to expect to be in the first team. Brandon Forbes maybe also saw one here. Just any young players that are promising enough to potentially get minutes in the team. I suppose there was a few that got minutes last year. I'm thinking Dead J got a few minutes. Elliot Miles has maybe broken in a little bit, but yet to really establish himself as a first team player. I suppose there may be a couple you could look at, Connor.
Yeah, I think they're the ones I would pinpoint. Barring a complete surprise. I mean, generally, I know maybe he pushed back on this a little bit on Monday, but you can only go off his track record. Liam Manning hasn't been a coach really who's kind of brought players in from the academy and gave them loads and loads of minutes, albeit he's not. I don't think he's worked at a Category 1 academy before, and maybe the options that he's had at other clubs haven't been as good as what Norwich have got. I don't know. I don't say that with sort of any knowledge based on the clubs that he's been at. For me, it's probably Lucien Mahovo, it's Elliot Miles. Can they really push their way in? Can they cement their case? And that's an interesting point. I think, again, maybe a point I will make at this stage that I think maybe hasn't been considered elsewhere is that there is a world, and certainly around midfielders, which is where maybe if you're an Elliot Miles, it becomes interesting. There is a world where in December till about February, Norwich could be without Anis Ben Slimani and Mankwa Forsum because of the African Cup of Nations. So there is a world where maybe they do need to carry a few more midfielders, or a couple of those younger guys could come into the fold. So I think there is that opportunity for them. I think, so if you're an Elliot Miles, I think you'd maybe, if you're not involved, would want to get back out on loan. But again, he's still so young. I think it's easy. It feels like he's been around for a few years, but he's still so young in the grand scheme of things that I think he could almost have another year of kind of getting a little bit of a taste for it. Whether he'd want to do that is probably a different question, though. So they're the ones more I see than a Brandon Forbes. Obviously, there were a couple of players on the final day, young ones who were in and around it as well. I know they like Tavares, who's sort of a younger lad who I think will be pushed into their 18s this year. But again, it's such a massive leap, and timing is everything. So yeah, for me, it's kind of Lucien Mahovo really nailed down that left back spot. Can Elliot Miles get some more minutes? And we'll see if there are any surprises along the way, which there could well be, because there's obviously going to be hopefully three new pairs of eyes on those young players when pre-season comes about.
Yes, Josh asking around Lewis Dobbin. Sam, can you sort of update us, I suppose, on whether there's any chance he'll return?
It's looking less likely now, I think, than it was when Johannes Stolarczyk was asked about it. And I remember, I think I've said this before, but I remember when he was asked about it. I don't know if it was by you, Connor, or me, or Paddy. I can't really remember, but he was asked a few months ago, and he came out way stronger on it than I expected. He seemed pretty confident actually that Dobbin would be back at Norwich this season, but I don't think it's quite there now. Obviously, he's had the long-term injury that actually, if you consider the fact that he's now gone back to Aston Villa for rehab and that's still ongoing, has turned into quite the significant injury. And when you look at the fitness issues that Norwich had last season, I think that is a consideration for them. I don't know if, in fact, I think they probably were a little bit put off by those fitness issues with Dobbin. Not only is there this big calf issue that kept him out for the rest of the season, but Torp actually talked about how his training and his load and his the way that he played was managed because of that injury risk. And I think when you look at the amount of criticism that Norwich have received, the fact that they really went deep into those issues sort of after the season ended, I think they'll be wary of signing another player who does struggle with fitness issues. I don't think they really envision a world where they could challenge for the playoffs this season as they attempted to last season with the number of injuries that they had, particularly around the sort of autumn period. So I think that's something they're definitely wary of. We know Dobbin really liked Torp, the way that he worked and the style of play, and that appreciation went the other way as well. So I think the change of head coach comes into it too. But all that being said, he's still a player they like. Obviously, I think most people would have seen that he was quite good in a Norwich shirt, scored a couple of goals, played pretty well a few times. And I think there is still that interest there. He's still somebody they're considering. But right now, it doesn't sound like those conversations are particularly active. I think the player is looking at different potential destinations. The club are looking at potential other options. So although they could come back together and talk about things later in the summer, right now it feels probably less likely than it ever has, to be honest.
Yeah, last few comments to clear up. Neil saying, any noise from Mark Attanasio with regards to investment in the squad? I suppose how much influence will he be having on this summer window, Connor?
Yeah, huge. I think you've seen the last couple in terms of the summers that they've had where they've made big-ish signings. I think last summer clearly Anti-Cianats was the biggest outlay. That would have been a player that Ben Napper would have presented to Mark Attanasio and his group about pursuing, and clearly was given the green light over. And likewise, Matej Jurasek in January, which was about 5.8, wasn't it? So there is a world again this summer where players get presented who they feel are of the age profile and are in line of with their strategy. That potentially could then be sanctioned only because Mark Attanasio has the cash to do it, and maybe that can be sort of taken out of or taken aside from the budget that they're working on. So yeah, I wouldn't totally rule it out. And you put that to Ben Napper, didn't we? And I don't think it's a case where it's just maybe even one. There is a world where if there's two players they like, maybe that's an avenue they could explore. So yeah, he's involved all the time, and clearly I think you can see it. The windows that they've had since Ben Napper has been in charge have been quite lucrative. They have been willing and are willing to pay relatively big fees for talent. So I think he has a massive say, and clearly it's only his financial power and that of his group that are able to elevate Norwich City into that world. Because previously on these shows, and Adam, you'll know, and Sam as well, how often did we speak about Norwich having to sell players before maybe they could do any real business? That doesn't feel like the world we're in now, and that's because of obviously Mark Attanasio and the finance he has behind him.
Yes, Jeffman asking, kit release soon. I just want news. Any news? Can you provide sort of any insight? I suppose it's usually sort of start of July time when the home kit gets released off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Well, they're playing, aren't they? They're playing a friendly on July the 12th, so it'll be before then. We can say that with.
I've got a feeling it's been pretty close to the start of pre-season the last few years. So that's probably some more bad news. I remember when they used to do it. They used to wear it on the last day of the previous season, didn't they? Bring back those days so that you don't have weeks of wondering when the new kit's going to come out. That's what I say.
It'll be yellow and green.
There we go, insider knowledge. Jimbo, the Spartan Canary, saying, hello guys, different topic, but do we know what Dutch teams we're going to be playing the pre-season fixtures against? Maybe I'll bump into you at a bus stop in Alkmaar again. Sort of any update on that Holland tour, Connor?
Yeah, well, obviously we're still waiting for confirmation, but I wouldn't just exclude the Dutch teams. I think there's potentially a Greek team, potentially a Belgian team, and a couple of Dutch ones as well. That the way it's going to work is they'll play some under-21 games, and then they'll play some senior games as well on the same day. So effectively 4 games, but they will be split between under-21s and first team. So we'll obviously wait for confirmation. I'd expect that to come pretty soon, if I'm honest, because we're getting quite close to the time now. TBC, but that's kind of, as of the last we heard, it was kind of teams from those countries they're looking at, and pretty good caliber of teams as well, all told, across that tour.
And to end the show on a light note, Tomato saying, any update on Fabio Quagliarella's situation to Norwich? And Neil saying, which one of you guys is on Morrison's car park lookout? I suppose your proximity to Carrow Road, Sam's the closest, so is that a job you're taking?
No. I am.
Paddy's not here, is he? So we could have Paddy's stationed
true.
somewhere in Riverside with a pair of binoculars.
I reckon if we told Jeffman that we'll pay for Morrison's sausage rolls the whole time he's there, he would do it for us. So
Not that I want to do
clear,
advertising for them or for anyone really, but have you seen the new foot-long sausage rolls they've got in there now, which are £2? I haven't tried one yet.
Advertising for them.
I'll let Jeffman try one of those, and he can report back to us.
There we go. And on that note, I think we're going to sign off this lunchtime. Thanks for all your comments and engagement. We've tried to get through as many as we can. We'll certainly bring those comments next time, and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can. Of course, thanks for joining us. As we said, lots of good content coming your way over the course of the weekend and next week. Pink and Plus is the place to go. $2.99 a month. You can take out a free trial, so well worth taking that offer up now. Of course, the YouTube. I think we're on the road to 11,000. So if you're not already subscribed, then please hit that subscribe button down below. We do greatly appreciate it. All the good content in terms of transfers and pre-season, the season, fixture release day, everything's coming your way over the next week. So we're the place to be. With that, we're going to sign off. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Hopefully the sun keeps shining. So we'll see you in the next one of these.